Old Vine Conference, in partnership with ZAP, has organized this unprecedented collaboration of more than 100 wines from California and around the world, and joined forces with such illustrious organizations as the California Wine Institute, Lodi Wine, the Historic Vineyard Society, and Sonoma County Wine Growers. It's a vision nearly 3 years in the making, and we are absolutely thrilled to have you in California, and deeply grateful for the support to make this conference happen. I am honored to serve as Executive Director for ZAP, Zinfandel Advocates and Producers. Yay! For 35 years, ZAP has been the champion of America's heritage wine and grape, Zinfandel. Think about that for a moment. Vines that qualify for Old Vine status through OBE this year were just beginning to be planted when ZAP began. From the beginning, ZAP has shared the story of California's wine and the history and advocacy for Zinfandel's right place among the great wines of the world. That commitment continues today as we work to grow this global community devoted to old vines and their preservation. This conference represents more than shared passion. It's a collective vision brought to life. Together, we celebrate excellence, we celebrate joy, and we celebrate both the legacy and the future of these living treasures. We are here to tell the stories of these vines, to honor the past while ensuring that old vines remain part of our continuing future. I am inspired by Meeting of the Minds, and I hope you will be too. This is the true power of working together, of connection, of purpose, and passion. Through this collaboration, we are demonstrating their enduring value and the importance of building this community to protect old vines for generations to come. And it is with great pleasure now that I give you Sarah Abbott, MW, and the co-founder of the Old Vine Conference. Sarah, cheers.
Hello, everybody. I'd just like to say a very few short words about those wines. Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. And when I was trying through those wines just now, which were so brilliantly selected by Evan Goldstein, thank you, Evan, I felt that kind of the fire and the passion and the kind of electricity in those wines. They're so diverse in style, but they shine not just what people with concentration. I think the old vine power is not just concentration, it's meaning and connection. And it's so inspiring and galvanizing to try those wines and to feel the connection and the way that connection to this heritage and tradition acts like a muse for winemakers. And I think that's why all of those wines have this just crackling energy. And it's now my great pleasure to hand over to someone who's done so much to highlight the joy of wine and to communicate the importance of the way that wines are grown and made and inspired so many people to seek out great wine. And so it's my great pleasure to to hand over to Jancis Robinson, Master of Wine, to deliver our keynote before and in conversation with Paul Draper. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Rebecca, and great to see lots of old friends here. I was reminded when listening to Rebecca that Zinfandel has played such an important part in my life. I was, back in the late 70s and early 80s, honorary secretary of something called the Zinfandel Club in the UK. And it was formed by my co-author of the World Atlas of Wine, Hugh Johnson, John Avery, very important open-minded wine importer in the UK, and the venerable Harry Waugh. And they'd noticed that California was making great wine, but that the Brits at that stage weren't quite aware of it. And at that stage, the famous Judgment of Paris hadn't been very widely publicized, but so that didn't actually have that much effect. But they thought they'd call it the Zinfandel Club because Zinfandel was only found in California at that stage. And part of my duties was to organize a tasting of all California wines that were then imported into the UK. And they suddenly proliferated in 1980 because the dollar was quite weak against the pound. And suddenly we were more aware of California wine, partly because of the efforts of the Zinfandel Club. And I had the job of organizing this tasting in the American Embassy in November 1980, where I met my husband of 44 years, Nick Lander, who's sitting next to Evan over there. At that stage, he was importing some California wines and told me that he was about to open a restaurant in London, Soho, called L'Escargot, and have an all-American wine list. And it was quite a thing then, quite unusual. Opening night, Robert Mondavi heard about it, moseyed along from the hotel he called the Dorchester for the opening night, and we ended up having dinner with him, didn't we? And the result was there was a diary editor at the next table, and there was a story about him and L'Escargot in the Times or the Sunday Times that weekend. So Zinfandel, and in particular, has played a part in my life. And I must say, going round that wonderful tasting, and I'm afraid there were just so many wines that I'm very sorry that I didn't get to any tables other than the California ones, partly because in London we're spoilt and we are exposed to a heck of a lot of wines of the world, particularly South African. And so I'm sorry that I gave the South African table a miss, but, you know, see them in London anyway. So I did concentrate on California. And I was rather sad to see the price disparity between Zinfandel and the few old vine Cabernets that were there. And this is just fashion and market forces in evidence, isn't it? That Cabernet just automatically gets a higher price, whether it's a better wine or not. And I'm not saying anything against Montebello, which I like very much indeed. But I would love to see less disparity, and the Zinfandels in particular being recognized for the quality and the very, very special heritage connection that they have in the state of California. My interest in old vines began gradually, really. I mean, I started writing about wine 50 years ago, and gradually, as I was tasting things, I was noticing that old vine wines they were just better. They were more interesting. They were better balanced. They just had a story to tell, obviously. And then I think it was on a trip here, sometime in the early years of this century, but crucially after the movie Sideways in Sonoma, I came across really quite a lot of instances where fabulous old vines were being pulled out to make way for fashionable Pinot Noir. So there's fashion again for you. And that, I suppose, highlighted, to me, the need to encourage people to keep old vines in the ground because they were making much more interesting wine than young vine Pinot Noir. Much of it was being planted in not necessarily the right spots. So when I discovered that in 2011, the Historic Vineyard Society was formed, I was very thrilled and very much supported it. I then realized that 2 years earlier in Australia, the Barossa Old Vine Charter had been formed to celebrate old vines in Barossa because That, like California, is a great repository of old vines. And then came 16, Rosa Kruger's fantastic work in South Africa at cataloguing every old vine, because thanks to KWV, the kind of regulatory body of South African wine, which had records from the early 20th century, it was possible to get all this information. So at least there are these 3 organizations really helping to encourage those who have old vines in the ground to share information, to be celebrated, to be identified. And this is very, very important. So on jancisrobinson.com, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, in 2019, we started something called the Old Vine Register. We thought we would like to do our bit to keep old vines in the ground, and started this listing of every old vineyard that we could find. And it started out as a spreadsheet, and it got extremely unwieldy. And did you tell me, Alda, it had 1,400? And about 1,800 entries in it eventually. Very messy. And some of them, the information was pretty dodgy. So we were delighted. Well, this is actually, I will tell you, we were sitting on this old vine register, but rather ashamed of what it looked like. But when I realized, with more detailed information, which we will be discussing, I'm sure, that old vines not only produced better wine, but were more resilient, and certainly, obviously, withstood drought so much better, because, as you all know, because of their root structure. I'm told, which is a contemporary sad fact, that they actually withstand wildfires better. And I think, but we'll talk about this, in some instances they withstand certain pests and diseases better. So there are these other factors that we want to celebrate about old vines and keep them in the ground. Every summer on jancisrobinson.com, we have a wine writing competition. And in 2021, the theme was an old vineyard. We wanted entrants to write about a particular old vineyard, because we sensed, quite rightly, that old vineyards have great stories to tell, human stories often, not just viticultural stories. And we had some wonderful entries. We thought it was great that we got 136 entries from around the world describing various old vineyards. Actually, this year, our theme was an ode to a grape variety, and we had 309 entries. But the winning one, by Chris Howard, was actually about a vineyard that some of you will know, how do you pronounce it? Evangelo in yes. Contra Costa, which is huge, so atmospheric. And he delivered lovely photographs too. I went to Contra Costa with a film crew and Randall Graham, actually, many years ago. That was fun. And that is an amazing part of the wine world. And let's keep those vines in the ground for as long as we possibly can. And Chris Howard, who won that competition, is actually now a professional wine writer and writes for us reasonably regularly. So that took us up to 2021. Then came salvation in the form of Alda Yarrow, there, of Vinography, who writes a column for us, did you volunteer? Yeah. Volunteered to transform this very, very messy spreadsheet into a beautiful, truly beautiful, free-to-access, open-source website called Old Vine Registry, not register, registry.org. And it is the most fantastic resource nowadays, searchable in so many respects. Very, very easy to add. You can nominate an old vine vineyard that is not there, that you think should be there, very easily, and Alda will check it out. And there's so much information. And crucially, there is a link from each vineyard to Wine Searcher so that people who are interested in old vines can actually buy the produce of those old vines, because we're not going to keep them in the ground unless there is a commercial incentive to do so. And there are now over 8,000 old vineyards. We had to decide what constituted old, and that's obviously a difficult question, and most of the vineyards represented here today are much, much older than this, but it was decided to, as with the Old Vine Heritage Project in South Africa, to take as the baseline 35 years, because that's at least a bit older than the normal lifespan of commercial vineyards. So there are more than 8,000 of them, which constitute more than 24,000 hectares of old vines, which is encouraging. We just want to make sure they stay there. So please do consult the oldvineregistry.org and do add anything that you come across that's not there. And you can very, very easily look up a vineyard and see whether it is there. So please use it. Let's all of us keep these vines in the ground. And I think we really need to celebrate the fact that we have the granddaddy of old vines, if you don't mind me saying so, Paul Draper here, who has notched up. I think I've done a lot. I'm an old timer, having written about wine for 50 years. Paul has been at Ridge Vineyards for 56 years and is thinking of retiring as chairman this year or maybe next, but is retaining the title of Winemaker Emeritus because, as he says, it's just too much fun to give up. So I think we should all clap Paul Draper. So, Paul, perhaps you'll begin by telling us how you came to admire old vines and discover them, and where and how.
Well, I'll start with Zinfandel, because at the base of Montebello Ridge, or I think at about 300 feet, something like that, is a 19th century vineyard. Almost nothing remains of it now, but back in '64, my partner, who was winemaker at that time, my later Ridge partner, David Benyon, when they stopped making wine at this vineyard called the Piketty Vineyard.
How do you spell that?
Pichetti.
Okay, thank you.
And they had moved to Montebello, Italian family, from nearby, working for the Jesuits, and bought land and as far as we know, started planting vines right away. I was hoping I could say they were planted in the 1870s. David Gates then tells me they were on St. George, which meant the late 1880s, more likely the 1890s. Anyway, I had never had, I'm sure I'd had blends, Gallo, whatever, made from Zinfandel, but consciously something called Zinfandel, because at Ridge, I was there to make the Montebello. And my history had been in pursuing the Bordeaux varieties. And so I made my first 69 Piketty Zinfandel. And it was phenomenal. I couldn't believe this grape that I'd never heard of, never tasted, could be of this quality. And so, in a sense, that was my introduction to both Zinfandel and its quality.
And old vines.
And old vines.
Yeah.
I go back in other ways, my interest in old vines. I bid on, back in the days when the great wines of the world cost virtually nothing. I mean, first growth 45s at $35 a bottle when they were 20 years old. Okay, those were my teachers, the 28s, 29s, and the 40s, all the 40s, 53, so on, when they just cost nothing, because I'm that old. And we bid on by Telex with Christie's.
Telex.
And yeah, and we bid on a number of things. Two friends of mine and I, and we got the 1864 Lafitte, and we got it for $350. It was over 100 years old, and it was from the Queen Mother's Castle, Scotland, Glamis Castle, and came over. We let it settle. We had a marvelous chef, was one of the three guys. Had this dinner, and it was unbelievably perfect. It had not faded in the least. The tannins had resolved. I consider it the greatest wine of my life. And I said, 100 years old, and it's of this quality. Those vines have an ability to show something extraordinary. So there were instances like that that convinced me. Oh, another thing was, in those days when Latour was owned by the English, they were the oldest vines in Bordeaux of the class growths, because instead of tearing out a block and replanting, they were doing what they call gardening, jardinage, which was replacing missing vines as they were lost. And it was another thing. I said, old vines again. There's got to be something here. And let me stop and ask you a question. You mentioned your first interest. And was it cultural, the history behind these vines? Or was it quality?
I think, to be unromantic about it, it probably was just the sheer quality. And it it was more going deeper into it that
Yes.
I understood there were stories and history. And that is the joy of wine, isn't it? That
Yes.
it's geography in a bottle and it's history in a bottle. Yeah, yeah.
And as we would take on a small vineyard, and I can talk about that, we would then look into the family history and get them to talk about their grandfather and so on.
Which is wonderful.
And yeah, we'd write these the labels and the little backgrounder, which would include the history of this family, if we were able to get that. But usually we could.
Well, so take us on then. So you identified that old vines were worth chasing. Yes. So apart from this Piketty, where was the next old vine vineyard that you identified and vinified?
So I spent, starting in '69, driving up to Sonoma and actually to Mendocino then, looking for old vineyards.
Why not Napa?
There were, in those days, it was, put it this way, what was the dominant varietal in Napa until 1970?
Something odd.
Petit Syrah.
Oh, right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Zinfandel was probably second. Cabernet was, I mean, you had Georgia Latour from the turn of the century, and with resistant rootstock, I'm sure, but it was a tiny, wasn't even listed in the federal
Ag report or whatever.
Ag
the crop
report
report,
until
yeah.
1936, I think. Anyway, but there was Zinfandel. Sonoma had, I don't know, 50 times the number of, or far beyond that, the number of remnant old vineyards compared with Napa. Napa had a number, and they're still there today, some of them the best. But Sonoma really was the place. And so I started driving around and stopping in, introducing myself, finding out if we could buy so many tons and try the vineyard out and so on. And we already were working with the Geyserville Vineyard. My partners they made their first Zinfandel in '66
That's
actually
before
is
you. Was it?
before me,
Yeah.
3 years before me,
Yeah.
from Geyserville, from the Geyserville vineyard up there, and those were all, as I mentioned, we had thought they might be 1880, but David tells me no, 1890s, and the wines we made from there, and made, I'd say, almost through the 70s, at least to the mid to late 70s, were all from 19th century vines. And because they were just starting to plant more Zinfandel. And
For white Zinfandel? Or?
Oh no,
No, that
they,
was pre.
they never,
Yeah.
thank God,
Yeah.
that handmade white. That was Pagani was what we saved a little bit from going entirely to white Zinfandel. But no, Geyserville were these old Cabernet and Carignan. And already in those river soils, the amazing thing was, because Zinfandel in most locations is not a high acid wine. It's moderate, it's sufficient. Most blocks of all of our blocks have excellent acidity, but Geyserville, my God, we had to deacidify some years. I mean, it was like, what's going on with this vineyard? Anyway, those wines were just to die for. The 73, I think I had my last bottle, and those were all 19th century vines, maybe 2 years ago, was still absolutely perfect. Had not faded in the least. So that showed the longevity of old vines, of potential. Now, not every old vine vineyard, whether it's being perhaps overcropped, not being, the viticulture is less than perfect, is going to give you the potential that an old vineyard, and is it in the soil and climate that really suits the varietal? That's, the next question. So we went through, I think it's hard to believe, hard for me to believe, over 30 years at least, something like 100 old vine vineyards. And some we would make just 1 year and drop it, sometimes 2 years and so on. The majority we dropped, and we focused down on the vineyards that consistently gave us distinctive individual character from that site and from that climate, those soils. And for us, that was the other thing from the beginning, was to try to make, well, first of all, single vineyard wines, because of the chance of showing what we all call terroir, that is, the distinctive character that an individual fine vineyard can produce, properly handled, properly, and again, the right variety, the right climate, the right soil for that variety. So that was the other side of why we were looking at all these individual vineyards, to show off their character.
And you were ahead of your time, because now single vineyard wines are all the rage.
Well, I hope so. I mean, you're telling me, I'm delighted to hear it. I used to go after, I guess it was Insignia, and saying, why don't you just, why do you blend all these vineyards? And just, you've got some great vineyards, just make that and show what it can do.
But they continue to make Insignia blend, don't they?
But most people, I guess, I'm kind of unaware of how that's gone, but I'm delighted to hear you tell me.
Into the more of LVMH. That's where it's gone.
There we go.
I know nowadays you're very punctilious about listing, or your back labels are brilliant anyway, but give so much information, but you'll say it's a field blend, it's got X% of Carignan and Y% of Mataro is the name you use, because that's the traditional name for Mourvedre. Yeah. Were you always, were you always conscious that you had field blends, or did that come a bit later?
We were, I think quite quickly we did know that, and the shock came when we actually sent somebody into the Geyserville vineyard to identify, and we found that there was less than 75% Zinfandel. So technically, we couldn't call it Zinfandel. So yes, we were aware. We weren't always aware of exactly what we had, but then as we went along, absolutely, in picking a small vineyard, you've got, you pick the separate varieties, and you can estimate very easily what the percentages are.
And field blends, of course, is another rather trendy concept now.
The fact that those growers in the 1880s, 1890s put Zinfandel, complemented it with Carignan to give it firmer acidity, and with Petit Syrah perhaps to enhance the body and the tannins. How they got to that, because it is an ideal field blend, just those three. The Carignan being perhaps the most important of the two complements to Zinfandel. How they so quickly arrived at that, and today we're still there. And another thing, when we plant a new vineyard, if we plant a straight, one of our favorite clones or selections, we have maybe 3 for Zinfandel, all from old vines. If we plant a straight Zinfandel vineyard, it's 10 years at least, and we're dropping crop because there's just too productive as young vines. If we plant a mixed varietal vineyard in the proportions of the old timers, within 6 years, 5 years, it's going into the assemblage. It is right up there with some of the older blocks. And why that happens, it's just amazing. But anyway, that's why we love those field blends.
And did you, when you were launching these single vineyard, either field blend or Zinfandels, did you feel that they were properly appreciated? Or do you feel that they're more appreciated now? What do you feel?
First of all, we started very small and worked our way up over from the time I joined. I think when I joined Ridge, we were making, the year before, we had made 2,800 cases. So from there to 1998, we grew. And from 1998 to the present, we haven't, on the average, 5-year averages, we do not increase our production, and we do not intend to. So it was over that period. So we started very small. So we didn't have a lot of wine to sell, and it all sold. And as the history of Zinfandel from that era, say 69 on, there were times when it fell out of favor. As you say, currently, likewise. But in those periods, it never fell out of favor for us. And I think it was those old vines and those field blends and the consistency of what we were attempting to do that our customers continued. We never saw a downturn in ours all those years of Zinfandel sales. Before you came to Ridge, you made wine in Chile, didn't you? And didn't you have some old vine experience there? Yes. I was in the Rio Itata and with old Cabernet, three old Cabernet vineyards. Pre-phylloxera material. Oh yes. And one Carlo Longeri out at Colemu, Rodolfo Rosle near Nipas, and the Gruber family near Nipas. And they had joined, the Grubers had joined the co-op and had this beautiful 2 or 3 story adobe winery with walls, you know, that thick. And anyway, so we leased the winery from them, and they had this wonderful crew that really had been trained in excellent winemaking. And we began to make Cabernet there. So once again, well, Chile, certainly in that area, and many parts of Chile had these marvelous old vineyards.
And still do. I mean,
do, yeah. And so there we were again. I mean, it was just proving itself over again. I mean, this is before I joined Ridge. This was the first chance I got. I had been taught by those great wines of the world, including the Inglenoks and La Cuestas from California from the 30s. They were the only ones that matched the quality of the fine Bordeauxs that I was using as my teachers as to what is fine wine. And I did stages and so on in Bordeaux, but I had not made wine, and got to Chile, and we decided, because we were running a little 3-person foundation to help with nutrition and community and so on, I got a chance to lease this bodega with my partner and make wine. So finally, back there in the, mid-60s, I got my first chance to be what, from age 16 on, I'd wanted to do. And so I applied all of that to these old vine Rio Itata Cabernets.
So old vines have been a thread through your professional life.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you agree? I think in South Africa, the big point made is that old vines actually are more sustainable, that they have a long-term future if you look after them well.
Yes.
There's a lot of theory, practice actually, about exactly how you prune them, and you can keep them in the ground.
Yes. And one thing you haven't mentioned, which economically is essential. As the vines age, their yield drops. And so in this era of people being so challenged, it's going to be, you have to be a fine wine producer. You have to have a clientele that is looking for the finest of the variety to really justify working and replanting and continuing with old vines, because those yields are as the vine ages. Yeah. And which is the exact reason that after 15, 17 years, maybe half of that 35-year limit that you set, people tear the vines out and replant because they need more yield.
I think in recent years, to your point, it's quite interesting to see the evolution of the Chilean wine business, where Itata and Maule were thought of as being producing wines merely for, to send north in bulk and bulk out inexpensive blends. And now they've got a real head of steam, thanks to Vinho and Al Maule, whatever, and they're doing exactly what you're suggesting, which is valorizing them, and they're getting much better prices, aren't they? And I'm sure, people like Stuart Spencer and so forth are trying to do that, and Tegan, who's here somewhere, trying to do that with Lodi, which is something absolutely necessary and justified.
Yeah.
But I suppose it is more difficult when you've got some really big, powerful buyers who just, kind of dominate the market and command the market.
And are not looking for that level of quality.
Yeah.
You have to have a market that knows what you're doing, what you're dedicated to, and you've got to develop that market. And if you have, and if you can do that, then you have a market for old vines, with the economics being more difficult.
Which I suppose is where Old Vine Conference, and everybody here comes in.
Yes.
And we have to do our best to educate consumers, quite how we educate the buyers of the world's biggest wine companies, I'm not sure. But if we've got this at least link, between Old Vine Registry and Wine Searcher and people actually understanding that old vines have a value, that is a help. Perhaps in South Africa, I know I keep talking about South Africa, but they have got this seal system, certified of heritage vines, where people can actually see on the bottle that they've got something special, which seems to have quite a lot to be said for it to me.
Yeah, that's the one thing you can do but in the end, it's what's in that glass. And what does your consumer, can he distinguish fine wine from, good wine?
But then, you've got to get them to actually buy the thing in the first place,
Yes.
haven't you?
Yeah.
So a bit of elementary education is needed. Tricky, yeah. Maybe it's a question of telling those stories, because behind every old vineyard, there tends to be at least one, if not several, great stories.
And you actually see people who have just planted this vineyard, have no history, write this marvelous story about their grandfather having planted this and done all of this, and it's total marketing. It didn't happen. I know. It's just, but it proves how valuable the story is. That you can do that, and that people will fabricate it just because of its power.
Marketing. So do you have any suggestions, because these are difficult times for wine, as we all know, for any practical suggestions for how we can get old vine wines to be perceived as worth paying for?
One thing that shocks me is that in a lot of polls, people buying good wines are not more interested because it's organic. That, to me, is an incredible shock. I really had hoped that people would understand and realize that they're consuming something that doesn't have potentially doesn't have the chemicals that some other wine might have. Just from vineyard chemicals. Unfortunately, it may have chemicals from the winery, but that hasn't been important. And that worries me about the same thing for old vines. How to get people, I think it's the story. I think really to get them interested in the history of that vineyard and the family, all of that is the best approach to convincing people that they should try an old vine wine. Because I think just the idea that the vines are old isn't going to sell it. I think it's got to be the story.
Well, you're very good at the ingredient label. You've been doing ingredient labeling for years before the EU said that they should. And now in the EU, we have these QR codes, which I think nobody ever looks at, actually.
I tried 40 years ago to get a label approved that had the ingredients. And the federal authorities said, nobody does it, you can't do it. About, 15 years ago? Yeah, exactly, about 15 years ago. Randall Graham presented them with a ingredient label, and they approved it. And the next year, we started and have never looked back. It's simple for us because there's so few things we need to list. I mean, it's the natural yeast, the naturally occurring malolactic bacteria, If we add something, oh, that was a great story, because at Paso Robles, they got overripe. We had to add, I think it was 2% water.
And you put it on the back label.
We put it on the back label, and the English said, "What? You've added water to your wine?" And we said it was 2%, you know. And but anyway, that label, the transparency. That's the other thing. Can you be transparent, and your customers begin to trust that transparency?
But I mean, it's all very well us sitting here, and we all love old vine wines and appreciate them fully. But then, you know, you've got something coming along like red blotch virus at the moment, which is encouraging vines to be pulled out. You've got economic mayhem, global wine consumption going down. It is going to be a struggle to keep those old vines in the ground.
Yes, but and red blotch is particularly difficult because it can spread, and even when you tear out an entire vineyard and you plant entirely new, you can find one or two, a few red blotch, and how that's happening is a big question. But we've had that before because California didn't read the research from the turn of the century in France, where they determined that the rootstock AXR was not resistant to phylloxera. So you had University of California at Davis and all the agricultural advisors, because AXR was grafted so easily and was such a joy to work with in that sense, that's what Napa Valley should plant. So as it went from Petit Syrah in Napa in the 70s in 1970 to becoming the dominant, it was all in AXR, or the vast majority, and the 80s, and I think into the 90s. And of course, then phylloxera hit, and all of that had to be ripped out.
Yeah.
Had to be ripped out. So, not that Cabernet is something. You and I were just looking up how much old Cabernet Sauvignon is there in Bordeaux, and the majority were planted. The oldest were planted 1988.
Yeah.
1985. Somebody was a little earlier, but I mean,
there's hardly any old vine in Bordeaux.
So Cabernet is, the fact that we have a 75-year-old Cabernet vineyard that we were just serving, I think it was 2013, from those 75-year-old vines, is extremely unusual. I mean, and certainly Bordeaux, that doesn't exist to anybody's knowledge. So,
well, if you search the Old Vine Registry,
and that's what you did.
What I did, and I was quite surprised when I put France in that there were far more entries than I was expecting, because I know that old vines in France are quite rare. But apparently, Alder explains that each little parcel has a separate entry. So, like, you've got a Burgundy vineyard, with 10 or 20 different owners, and that generates 10 or 20 different entries in the,
Okay.
But certainly California is a great hotspot for old vines, and thank the Lord.
Well, the joy for me of traveling in the 70s, all through Sonoma and up into Mendocino, I think I told you that story that I was up in Mendocino and stopped in a small winery, actually a guy named Darren Edmeades. And he invited me I told him I was up there looking for old Zinfandel. He wasn't making Zinfandel. And he invited me to spend the night, and he said, "Oh, there's a vineyard up on Vinegar Ridge. We call it that because they dump the pumice in the creek." And and Ed Pronzolino owns it. And they're 19th century vines. So the next day I drove up and talked to Ed and arranged to buy those grapes. And it made one of the finest Zinfandels, right up there with Pichetti. I mean, different character, but just amazing. And it turned out it aged beautifully. I went back the next year, and I called Ed before I went up. And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Darren Aidmeads has bought them." And so you never know what's going to happen.
You're in a fight.
But that is the Duprat-Dupatti clone of Zinfandel from Ed Pranzolino's old vines. And we used that. So we were able to get the clone years later and propagate it.
Yeah.
So.
Very good. I think that's just about it, but am I allowed to say, are there any questions? Yes? May I? Yeah? We're nearly there, but are there any questions? Or are you, yes, Josh has one there.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether Ridge has any sort of tracing of what the overall population is and how quickly it's diminishing, or whether it's growing at all.
I know because I checked with our vineyard director, David Gates, who was one of the founders of our
Historic Vineyards
Society. And so he gave me information on a number of vineyards, but I also know that you mentioned it already. In the Russian River area, for example, that they can get so much more money for Pinot Noir that a number of great old small and medium-sized Zinfandel vineyards, because it's such a marvelous area for Zinfandel, are being torn out. So we don't have a balance that I know of, but I'm fearful because of that balance may be going the wrong way.
In Rioja and Priorat, the Consejo there are setting up those logs. So
Oh, fantastic. And we all mind here, right?
yeah, I've got some links to the entities doing that research, which I can share.
Awesome. I would love that.
Just if you didn't hear that, Sarah just pointed out that in Priorat and Rioja, they are keeping a log of the extent to which vines are being pulled out, and which is very useful. Anything else, or shall we eat? Would be quite nice.
It would.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. You got.
Thank you. Sure.